increase the air rate depending on the shape of the buildings and depending also on the amount of balconies. So the ruggedness of the surface of the building has a direct impact in air movement. So that's something that basically we can visualize and we can control in buildings, and depending on the form that we give to buildings, we are going to create different air air systems. I think that maybe we're getting close to the end and of this session. Now I would like just simply to mention a number of policies. So we've seen also we've seen now the history of the thinking of air through the 19th and 20th century. We've seen how it gets integrated in buildings and in urban fabrics. We've seen the tools that have been progressively being constructed in order to enable us to map and to model the air. And now we're going to see what have been the policies, what have governments done in order to control or to improve microclimate in cities. As I said at the very beginning of the lecture, this is data from 2014, and I've read later on even more worrying statistics about people dying related to air pollution. This is from the World Health Organization. 7 million people in the world died of air pollution, and so obviously we've talked about the gray smog in 1952 and the Health Act passed in 1956 as a result of the Great Smog. We haven't talked about Rachel Carson. Have you heard from Rachel Carson? No? Rachel Carson was a kind of activist in the 60s in America who was a very influential character who basically produced the first US Clean Air Act in 1963 as a result of a book that was became very famous in the 60s called Silent Spring, which is one of the historical texts of environmental activists worldwide. So after this is the still from actually Frank Lloyd Wright movie called which he did in order to promote Broadacre City, the kind of expansion of cities beyond New York and Chicago and the kind of urban centers into cities that are more embedded into the territory. And he was basically referring to the smog in New York in 1966, and immediately after the Air Quality Act 1967, which was an amendment on the Clean Air Act that Rachel Carson had produced in 1963. This is Richard Nixon signing the Clean Air Act in 1970. The next example, or the next iteration of clean acts in the U.S. George W. Bush in 1992 signing the first climate change agreement in the UN Conference of the Environment in Rio de Janeiro. So then, I mean, this has to do with moving these policies to some sort of global policies. This is Pruitt, who was Scott Pruitt was the director of the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. under Trump, who was basically rolling back these policies. You can, and this is again, and there are lots of which was interested in reducing burdens on EU red tape. So what you can see is that these things are political. I mean, depending on the politics, policies take place. So maybe Trump versus Macron, or and so these are. I mean, we already seen this. It is quite interesting to see that most of these global policies are fairly toothless. They have very little effect on the way things end up working. And what I would like to and this is a kind of example of how different air quality standards apply in different environments. Unfortunately, I don't know the environments in Korea. Maybe somebody can find out, but this is how national or even continental regulations limit ozone emission, fine particulate, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and carbon monoxide, which are the main parameters that are used to measure the quality of the atmosphere by regulations. And you can see, actually that the American one is the most permissive one in most, I think in all cases. The American one is much more permissive than the European one or the Canadian one, etc., etc. So the question of who sets up the quality standards of air on a kind of global or on a national or even on a local, which is basically the thing that I would like to maybe propose for you to think after as a kind of outcome of this session, which is that one of the things that is happening now in many places is that there are policies that are increasingly localized, which I think, most of the policies that governments use to control the quality of air are of a very large scale. But because of the development of certain technologies today, we can start developing policies that have a much more specific and local effect. So, that has to do with the tools that we have. It's the first weather station in Athens, which is called the Tower of the Aides, the Tower of Winds 50 before Christ. This is the way we are looking at concentration of particles in a city today, based on something that is called OpenSense. So what is interesting about now is that we have many different ways of sensing climate parameters. So all these parameters that are dictated by global policies, almost on a continental or on a national level, are to some degree useless in terms of designing cities, particularly when we have increasingly sophisticated tools to measure the quality of air by different ways. Let's move quickly. I didn't remember I had this session also here, but maybe I'll mention some few things about this. This is the way we used to climatologists used to measure air quality. So we had these kind of weather stations that were actually quite sophisticated and quite quite expensive to run and very precise, but they produce a very low resolution of data. When we were talking before about the resolution of data, so climatologists using 1 by 1 kilometer, but urban climatologists using a much closer resolution. So these weather stations were designed for climatologists. So they are located, 30 kilometers apart. They're super precise. They're super expensive. But they have very little resolution. So we cannot really design urban microclimates using this technology. What is interesting now is that we have this technology, which is basically a technology based on what is called smart citizen platforms, which means that there are people who are having mini weather stations that are perhaps not so precise, even they're very imprecise, like mobile phones that are enabled to measure certain parameters, or DIY sensing. So there is an increasing amount of agents in urban environments that can measure the quality of air in cities. So as opposed to the weather stations that are very scientific, very precise, calibrated, expensive, require very high expertise to manage, and they have very high time resolution, which means that in the location where they are placed, they can measure with great precision the variations of these parameters in time, but they have a very low spatial resolution against or as opposed to weather stations. Today, what we are increasingly seeing is that we have access to DIY sensing, which is basically crowdsourced data. And crowdsourced data are much less precise. They are achieved through redundancy. They are cheap. They have a medium time resolution, so they are not constantly measuring precisely the changes in the parameters, but they offer a much higher spatial resolution. So you can know more or less what is happening in closer environments, and therefore you can act. You can act to the point where you get a message in your cell phone saying this route today has a very high concentration of carbon monoxide, don't cycle through it. And so people are going through a different path. So this kind of infrastructure based on citizens' practices are increasingly available in large cities. I don't know exactly what is the situation in Seoul, but in London there are quite a few of these websites that produce these kind of messages and enable us to look at air pollution, for example, with a much higher resolution. So basically what we are seeing in these technologies is that we are going to a mesoscale, to a microscale of the models. That's the kind of advantage that this capacity to measure urban microclimates gives us now. In terms of being able to map all these parameters, the nitrogen concentration, the fine particulate content of air, etc., is something that is increasingly localized. So there are examples of these technologies where you know that the fine particles or the VOCs in the volatile organic components in certain areas of the city are higher than others. And they are starting to affect, in some cases in the United States, they're starting to affect real estate. This is something that happened traditionally in cities. I think in I can't remember now. In Seoul, the air is mainly the rose wind of Seoul. Air is coming mostly from the northwest, if I remember correctly. Right?
Yeah.
Do you know this? Yeah. It's northwest, right? So, generally speaking, in other cities, the most expensive real estate would be located in the place where the wind is coming from, because that was the healthier areas in the city. So that was a kind of intuitive, popular wisdom that has been operated in cities forever, basically. So people downstream, both in terms of water movement and in terms of air movement, are bad. Upstream is good. But now we have mechanisms that enable us to, because maybe downstream, but it is behind some sort of park that purifies the air, or is behind the mountain, and therefore the boundary layer goes somewhere else. So we can start to plan the movement of air in cities with much more precision due to the availability of these technologies that enable you to see cities with this level of precision. I believe that, if I could make a prediction about where this is going to local agency, to increasingly smaller scale policy units that are going to be deciding about microclimates in the sense of micro scale, small scale of operation, as opposed to these kind of large scale policies that we were seeing, Bush and Nixon and blah blah blah, saying, okay, the parameters have to be these for good quality. I mean, not that this is irrelevant, it is obviously very relevant, but it's not a tool that we can use as urban planners or architects. The tools that we can use are becoming available now, were not available 10 years ago, and will take time to be fully usable. But I believe, and this is something that we will see almost through every one of the urban ecologies, that probably the next future is going to be about localization. We'll see it in the management of water, we'll see it in the management of energy, we'll see it in the management of production and recycling. So this is, I think, if I could maybe make some sort of forecast of things that we are going to see in the future sessions, I think that this is where urban thinking, urban ecologies is going to go. It's going to go to increasingly smaller scale of policy. I think this is the last slide. I don't really have anything else to tell you. Maybe about air, but I don't know if any of you want to mention something or has a question about any of these issues. I'm happy to answer or to try to engage with you in a conversation about it. Overcome your shyness. Nobody.
Yeah.
This is kind of typical Asian style. In the US, the students would kind of fall over each other to talk. It's funny, these kind of cultural differences. Not that I think. I mean, I really like Asian students. I like better actually Asian students than American students. but it's interesting that you want to say something.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm not cities have been changed by some kind of disease that comes into city. What will be changed by the future in the future, and kind of COVID or kind of some type of disaster has come? What is your prediction in the city?
Well, I mean, basically, I mean, COVID, obviously, all architects everywhere became very interested in COVID because there were physical things that we had to do. We had to put barriers. We had to suddenly everybody wanted to have a terrace. I mean, this is something maybe didn't affect Seoul very much, but all European cities, for example, people suffered a lot when there were the lockdowns, because there are many places that don't have, many old buildings don't have terraces. And people were really suffocating inside of their houses because they couldn't get out, they couldn't, so there was some sort of claustrophobia, and I think, I can't remember where I read the statistic. I think it was Switzerland that suddenly open terraces increase the value of property by something ridiculous, like suddenly a place with a very large terrace in the roof, so everybody started producing this kind of open spaces in case you get a lockdown and you cannot leave your house. But maybe I don't know whether that would actually, I mean, it was very interesting at the time, and maybe it's still interesting, and I mean, policies, for example, for plumbing in universities, in university campuses, for example, I know that have changed and have promoted to have more open spaces inside of residential buildings. I mean, residential policies also are starting to ask for roof terraces and terraces in the middle of the, so there has been maybe some effect of COVID in particular in this sense, but I am more perhaps more interested in the idea of microclimate as something that we can design. So we don't, when we design a piece of urban fabric, or we design a building, using some of these tools, we should be able to use the tools to mass the building, to basically decide whether it's a kind of pitch roof or a flat roof, or it has vegetation around, or it